Hello and welcome at episode 222 of the Ed Honning Show. This is a Dutch podcast normally, but if you want to listen to the episode with Nathalie Nahai in English, just skip this Dutch introduction for just a couple of seconds. Welkom in de Ed Honning Show, aflevering 222, waar je leert van ondernemers en ondernemende mensen die bijzondere resultaten bereiken, hoe ze hier gekomen zijn, wat ze doen, de strategie en hoe ze klanten krijgen. Mijn naam is Ed Honning en ik deel mijn opgedane kennis, ervaringen en expertise met jou. Ik coach ondernemers die kennis leveren aan bedrijven om beslissingen te nemen die in hun eigen belang zijn, zodat ze sneller bereiken wat ze willen, terwijl ze meer vrijheid voor zichzelf creëren. Vandaag, today, the conversation with Nathalie Nahai. Nathalie is an international speaker and author of the best-selling book Webs of Influence, The Psychology of Online Persuasion, which has been translated into 7 languages. Her work explores the intersection between persuasive technology, ethics, and the psychology of online behavior. Nathalie speaks internationally on the psychology dynamics behind consumer behavior, teaching people how to ethically apply behavioral science principles to enhance their website, content marketing, product design, and customer experience. She's also the host of the Hive podcast and Seeking the Self podcast. It has been 2.5 years since we had our last conversation for this podcast, and that was about the psychology of online persuasion. I have been following her conversations in the Hive podcast lately about the environment and ecology. A couple of weeks ago, I sent Nathalie a long email rambling about my thoughts and worries, looking for some advice. Then I thought it would be a great idea to have a talk with her just about this topic and dig into the business and the effect on our environment. We also talk about art, community, cities, and connection. It felt like the conversation was going all over the place, and in the end, it was all connected nicely together. Enjoy the insights with Nathalie. Let's get started.
Welkom in de Erno Hanning Show. De podcast waarin je leert over de beslissingen om te groeien als ondernemer met je bedrijf. Luister naar de persoonlijke verhalen van succesvolle ondernemers en ondernemende mensen. Dan nu, jouw business coach, Erno Hanning.
We are back in the house with Nathalie Nahai. It's great to talk to you again, Nathalie.
Thanks, and it's always nice to talk with you too.
We did a podcast recording on your book in 2017, which was sent out in 2 parts. It all was about your main topic, web influence. And I've been following you since then and before that probably as well, but and looking at what you do online and all those things that you have together. And I thought it's great to have a chat with you, how you combine all the stuff that you do, and also the interest that we have and we share about the environment and ecology. So
yes,
let's get a little bit back to the past, because I think the first thing that you did was what I didn't notice before, but when I was looking you up was you've been studying art a lot.
Yeah.
Because you started in psychology, you had a Bachelor of Science there, but then you did a BA in Fine Arts.
Yeah, that was back in the day. So my first love was always art since I was very little, and then it was mostly because I discovered psychology almost by chance at A-level between the ages of 16 and 18. And I fell in love with it. I had a wonderful, wonderful teacher. And it was because of that my parents actually suggested that I do a BSc first in psychology and then do art afterwards, because it can be quite difficult to make money through art. And so they thought, well, at least if you've got psychology, then you can fall back on that and maybe combine the two. And so I followed their advice. I think it was I think it was really wise advice. And then so did the psychology. Then did a foundation year of art at St. Martin's. Then I started the degree, and then I ended up leaving. I think it was about 2 years into it. I got very bored because it wasn't providing me with what I was hoping for, which was technical skilling up, and a lot of the contemporary art stuff. My experience of it back then was like watered down psychology with none of the academic rigor, and so it wasn't doing either the psychological aspect or the arty technical aspect. So I decided to jump ship and switch to music for a few years.
Yeah, because I was also looking at your YouTube channel, and I saw also your YouTube channel name is Nathalie Nahai Music. So
I know, I've been trying to change it for years and I can't get it to change. Oh yeah, because it used to have lots of music on it. I was in the music industry for 5 years. I did 2 albums. I travelled in the States. I was doing recordings. I play violin and guitar, and I've been singing since I was very, very young. And so that was like a vestige of another chapter of time.
Yeah, but I think the mixture is. I can imagine that the mixture is a great addition in both things. That you learn about psychology will help you in your art, especially when I look at your paintings that you do and the pencil drawings. And I can imagine the other way around. When you, for the work on psychology, you can use the time to spend with yourself to think about these concepts.
It's very astute. It's funny having this conversation, talking about this, because it's I tend to, in my mind, I tend to think that these aspects of my life are quite separate, but of course they do feed into each other. And the course I'm doing now, like you say, it's to do with the drawing and the painting. It's a 3-year kind of academic method atelier, where you do actually spend a lot of time standing quietly watching the person, the model that you're working with, or a still life, or a copy that you're doing. And it's funny because I spent so much time in the last 3 years listening not just to music, but also predominantly to podcasts and interviews. And I find that as long as the interview isn't too image-based, so I can't listen to lots of really rich fiction books or whatever like this, because the imagery interferes with the actual visual information that I'm processing, like a Stroop test or something. But yeah, it means that actually I can do a lot of listening and research and reconnaissance on things like psychology, or more recently you mentioned the climate breakdown, things like this, that it gives me the ability to do 2 things at once, which is deeply exciting, actually, to have that space and time.
So when you look back, are you happy that you followed the direction of your parents' decision, so that first do this, then that?
Yeah, I think I am, because it just has given me more opportunities to combine skills that otherwise I might not have developed in that way. So I don't think that the academic route is the only way, by any stretch of the imagination, to understand and learn about the world and to be curious and engaged and to contribute. So I think it's one option, and that was the option that I took at the time. And I think now it enables me to have a sort of a basis from which to explore other questions. So I like the psychological framing, and I like the rigour that it allowed me to develop, and an appreciation for making sure that the research that I cite is of high calibre. So all of these things that allow you to approach the world in a certain way. But I think it definitely means that now I feel like I have more of a freedom. Now I've built this base to be able to explore things that I otherwise might not have given myself permission to. And it acts as a counterpoint for the more intuitive, or I also want to say almost there's sort of different aspects. The intuitive and the emotional side is one, the more sensuous side is the other, because, you know, when you're painting all day, you're working with sensuous materials and you're physically very involved in what you're doing because you're mark making. And I think that having those two facets, so the psychological, the thinking, the intellectual, a very particular type of thinking, and then a very different type of thinking and an embodied way to learn and to express, having those two approaches, plus probably more, is very exciting, because then it means that you can play with ideas in perhaps a different way. And I find myself learning to think and see and experience differently through the practice of art. Because standing, watching and drawing and learning to see 5 hours a day, every single day, is going to have an impact on the way that you experience the world.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I also wonder, because you're back at school, and that also probably means that it has a lot of impact on your income, that the basis of your work as the web psychologist is a good basis to finance, to make the other work possible, the artwork possible?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think I feel extraordinarily lucky that I've managed to build in the direction of a career where I get to speak maybe, I think my average is like 22, 23 conferences a year, and they come in seasons. So there's certain seasons that are more busy than others, but I get to speak that many times a year. I get to do remote consultancy to help clients apply some of this stuff. And it means that the rest of the time I can choose to explore things that I'm excited about. And of course, these things feed into one another, but it means that there's a huge amount of flexibility and freedom in being able to use all of that other time to develop ideas, to develop skills. It's not a particularly common path, and sometimes I do stand there thinking, oh God, what am I doing? But I don't think I could do it another way, I think.
Yeah, could you imagine at one point that you would just focus on one thing, because whatever you focus on and give more attention, it probably grows?
Yeah, I think my life generally tends to work in projects, and I've noticed this looking back over the last, I'd say like maybe 15 years. So I had 5 years where I was intensely focused on music making, and so spending time recording in the States. I had 2 albums that I worked with, that I put out, developed certain skills in that area, and then that chapter shut, and then the new chapter of web design, psychology, and the book opened, and I put all of my attention and focus into that, and the music became something that I just had personally for myself, and the art took a real backseat. And then this chapter opened, the current one, in 2017, when I was taking a sabbatical for the second edition of the book. So I came here in 2017 in Barcelona to just have a 3-month break, and then just completely fell in love with the art and the process, and rediscovered this long forgotten part of myself that I'd completely disconnected with in some ways. And I think now that I've been able to build a business to a point where it's mostly tending to itself. It's like when you plant a garden, the initial work can be quite strong and involved, and takes a lot of effort and conscious caretaking. And hopefully you get to a point where you just have to make sure that you're putting nourishment in when it's needed, but it's a lot less demanding of constant attention. And I find that now with my work being where it is, and also having holiday breaks where I can work quite intensively on the work that I'm still doing with the web psychology stuff, it's reached a point where I've been able to focus for a certain period of time on other things that I can develop a passion in. And when I finish the course in March, it'll be 3 years and 3 months, I have plans to dive back again into the work, into the psychology side, and start to push that. And so I think I asked myself this question quite a lot of, comparing myself with others and thinking, wow, if I only had one specific thing that I really threw myself into, what could be achieved? And I try it, but my brain doesn't like it. I can do maybe like 9 till about 4 in the daytime on one thing, and then my brain needs to do something else, and my performance just plummets after that time if I continue in a specific area. So I think I'm the kind of a certain constellation of traits that requires a networked approach where I'm pulling from different skills or interests, and I can dive in for a certain period of time, but then I just need to switch. Otherwise, my whole system just doesn't work as well, which is annoying, because then I look at other people and I think, oh, if only I could do X, Y, and Z. And then I think about other people who are actually, like, one of my favourite ones to think of, gives me a bit of hope. People like Da Vinci, they did loads of things, and I'm not anything like Da Vinci, but at least there's a precedent of some sort of someone who was able to do many things, and they all fed into one another. So, yeah.
And I also think that when you do focused work, like you, for example, you say that it takes about 4 hours a day and then your attention goes away. That happens a lot when people, like famous artists and writers or chess players or tennis players, when they do a lot of focused attention work, it generally takes about 4 or 5 hours, and then they go start do something different. At least that's what I'm reading in the books, and I listen to a lot of podcasts, for example, from James Altucher, who's really into this 10,000 hour rule. And I think that focus time is really important, but also the non-focus time, so the time away from your main topic.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the thing is, like, we have this idea, and I do wonder how it ties into our cultural contexts. And it depends obviously on the country as well, how far we can push this idea. But, you know, if you think about how in many Western cultures we think about performance as something which you commit to, and you discipline yourself, and you really go as far as you can and push as hard as you can. And we have this idea, it's kind of, I mean, it ties into our approach towards resources and in the living world as well. It's a sense of push harder and faster and more discipline, and you're going to get to the top, and you've got to keep fighting. And it's a very, very almost like a linear approach. And we forget that we live in cycles, that if you look at any system, typically in order for it to be a thriving system, a nourished system, it needs to be able to have downtime and regenerative time in order to create. And I think the same is true of human beings, and I think the same is true of the creative process, whether that's someone who's involved in medical discoveries, scientific discoveries, technological discoveries, whatever it might be. So all the way from the sciences to the arts, which, by the way, I think don't have such a distinct division between them as we might be led to believe. I think we need these periods of quote-unquote downtime, because they allow for us to deepen our sense of engagement in the world, engagement with ourselves, our sense of connection with how we feel about things, being able to drop in and ask maybe deeper questions, because otherwise we're just skimming the surface of what's possible. And this desire for speed means that we forfeit the possibility for depth. And I think that we need to be able to deepen our inquiry and our experience of life, especially when we face huge crises, which we are currently facing.
Yeah, I agree. And so I think that the funny thing is, of course, that when you look at somebody else, and like you said, you admire somebody who's really putting attention to it, I often think, I wonder if this is really true. There's a lot of things you don't see what they do and how they work. And also, I think the way that you work is the way that, if you're an entrepreneur, or if you are an independent professional, this is a really great way to work. You're not working in a factory or in a building or in an office where you need to work from 9 to 5 and you need to do your stuff in those hours, which probably most of the time they are just effective for also the same 4 or 5 hours, and the other work is just work to fill up the day.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, isn't it, that we give ourselves these arbitrary containers of time to make things structured so that we can say, okay, well, if everyone in the country is doing 9 till 5, then we can all agree that we can call each other during these hours. And, you know, but it's still arbitrary. I mean, if you look at quite a lot of the research around interconnected themes such as well-being and performance and productivity, you tend to find that 4-day work weeks, where the work days are slightly shorter, tend to be much more optimal. And And so we kind of think, well, why is it that we haven't split tested ways of working and living, so that we're not just optimizing for time spent at work? And I often find that, simple tests for yourself, for your own way of working, can include things like batching emails, which I know people talk about. So just doing emails once a day at the end of the day. So for instance, if I'm really in flow with my art, unless there's anything else that's super urgent, and I do check my emails, but I won't respond to them until the end of the day, where, then I'll have maybe an hour, half an hour, and then I batch it all together, and it means that I'm much more productive and much more focused. And so I think tests like that can be very helpful in figuring out what rhythm is most productive and useful for you. And of course, different people have different approaches.
And you say you do check email during the day, but you only reply in batches. But why do you check the email during the day?
So, well, here's where I fall into the category of being, what's the word, susceptible to dopamine loops as the rest of us. But two reasons. One, because like everyone pretty much, I'm conditioned to seek out that hit, and I like stimulation, even though it's really unsatisfying. So there's that aspect. And then the other aspect is that if, for instance, especially in times like this where there's a lot of conferences coming up, if, for instance, someone needs to jump urgently on a call, or there's something that's really important that can't wait, then I need to be able to flag that and then assess the urgency and respond swiftly. Because even though I'm doing the studying, I don't want my work to suffer. So it's always a bit of a juggling act in that sense.
No, I think I understand, but also, how often does it really happen that it is that urgent that you need to check it?
Super rarely. It's really rare.
I know that's because I have these discussions with my clients, and I think it's a really interesting topic because I do the same thing. I try to make them aware of batch the moments that you check your email and your replies. I say do it 2 times a day, at 11 and 4, for example. These are great times because people are going to lunch, so they want to reply quickly to you. And same as by the end of the day, then they want to reply quickly to you before they leave the office. And if you do it that way, because when you check email, even if you don't reply, you're distracted. Because if somebody's sending you a message that hits you or hurts you or influences you emotionally, it affects the work that you're doing right now.
Yes.
If you're in a creative process, it will take you like 20, 30 minutes to get back into it. So so for me, it's just, and I know I do the same thing. Obviously, some days are great. I don't do it, but other days when I'm just, distracted, I just check my email like 10 times a day, and it really doesn't help. Yeah,
you're right. I think it's the thing of like knowing about it, and some days when you're really in flow, being able to not do that is one thing. But then, like you say, sometimes we're distracted, or sometimes we're wanting something to change. I've noticed definitely a pattern in my behaviour in the last 3 weeks. So living in Barcelona at the moment, there's a lot of upheaval, there's a lot of protesting happening, and you can sense it. I mean, even though we're not right in the middle of it, you can sense it. And with the uncertainty of Brexit, and with all the climate stuff that I'm reading about, I feel like I'm in this very unsettled, uncertain space. And I've noticed that when I'm in that space, my desire to be lifted out of that uncomfortable position, that discomfort, grows. And one of the things that I do, which is not a particularly helpful thing, is to seek distraction precisely through things like email or content that then feeds into that discomfort because it's inherently unsatisfying and stimulating potentially the wrong way. And so it's that tricky thing of catching it and then saying, okay, well, maybe actually what I need to do is put my phone on airplane mode and listen to some music instead, and or connect with someone or have a cup of tea or something. But it's tricky.
Yeah.
I'm definitely no saint when it comes to that.
No, but the thing that I do is I have a block in the morning set every day. I start pretty early, and I start by first I check some social media like Twitter. I love it, and I just spent like half an hour doing this LinkedIn and Twitter thing, and that's about it. Then I start reading. I read books on my Kindle. I start reading, and then I read for 45 minutes or so, maybe an hour, and then I start writing. So in general, I try to do my writing before 9 o'clock in the morning, so that
Ooh, that's early you start.
I know. I'm sorry, but so when I work with clients or something, I try to start doing things for them from 9 o'clock, so that that I follow the rules from offices around the world. But also then I even have the phone on silent mode or airplane mode almost through all the day.
Yes. And
it helps me a lot to just focus on the work that's in front of me and not being distracted by my phone. And whenever I want to go to, for example, Twitter, I go to it on my time, on my terms, and not or whatever, not when somebody's buzzing me.
Yeah, I think so I will always have my phone on silent unless I know that I'm waiting for a call. And I find that it's just so much more restful, because otherwise if you have it on the whole time, it's just constantly waiting for you to get distracted, and it's kind of it becomes much harder to ignore. At least when the notifications are off, you're not constantly being called back to your device. Yeah.
So okay, you moved for a I forgot
sabbatical?
the word in English.
The sabbatical.
To Barcelona sabbatical. Yeah. Sorry, you said it. I just didn't hear it. Sabbatical
okay.
in 2017, right? So, why Barcelona?
Honestly, because it was one of these accidental things. Well, yeah, serendipitous things, where one of my cousins who lives I have family dotted around in different countries, and one of my cousins lives in Gibraltar, and her partner had shown me some beautiful drawings that he'd done the year before, and I saw them and I was like, well, how did you learn to draw like this? I've been looking, years ago I looked for a course or a teacher and I couldn't find it, and he basically told me about the Barcelona Academy of Art, and so I came in 2016 over the summer for a short course. It was just a week long, and that was the moment where I thought, wow, this is an amazing place to be. I felt excited, I felt uplifted, and the course was really interesting. It was super structured, and I liked the discipline of it, and I liked the place, and so it was basically because of that. And then my dad's side of the family is from Gibraltar, and I actually have ancestors from Catalonia, where I am now. And I think there's just something when you arrive in a place that you feel a connection with. There was something about this place that just made me feel like I was home and like I was uplifted. And people here are much more physically warm. I know it's the Mediterranean and it's warmer anyway, but it just felt a lot more natural to me, because I've always tried to inhibit my physical warmth to people, because in the UK in London it's a bit easier because it's international, but it's not particularly common, whereas here I can just be myself and people are very responsive, and I find that really lovely. Yeah, I
can imagine. Yes, I can understand that from the times that we met, so then you started also doing the studies in Barcelona. Do you feel it is the temperature, the Mediterranean effect? I'm not sure if it's really Mediterranean, but the how do you call this? The temperature and everything, the humidity and everything that influences the way that people interact?
I think that's got a lot to do with it. I'm sure it has a lot to do with it. I think, when you're somewhere, I definitely notice this. You can see it I've seen this so much in London, and I'm curious what it's like in the Netherlands as well. But you know, when it gets hot and suddenly everyone comes out, they strip off their layers, they get into the sun, they get their vitamin fixes, and they generally people transform when they're in a place which is warm. I mean, do you have that in the Netherlands?
Yes, we do.
And I remember seeing this in Berlin as well. Like, so I'm thinking, okay, all these cold countries where people are super efficient, super focused on work, not to the expense of our well-being as much as in some countries, like for instance in the US, where the culture is quite different in parts. But I think that warmer climates generally tend to have an emphasis on social cohesion in a way that is not possible in colder climates. So for instance here, it's really common to go out to a square and be out till like 11 or 12 at night and see babies out being breastfed and their grandmothers in their 90s sitting on a bench with a blanket over their knees and another 2 or 3 generations in between. Like, that's something which is made possible because you can come out and it's temperate. And also the food is amazing here. Everything is locally grown, so there's a sense of, I feel as though there's a sense of greater connection with place, with one another, with family. In schools, the way that people are taught here, a lot of it is to do with emotional intelligence and communication, which is something that, you know, of course, also has an impact on the ways in which people are together. So I think it's a whole host of factors.
Yeah, I can see now you're talking about this, is that going out at night into a square or into a place where there's other people too, looking for connection, looking for conversations. It's a lot easier when the temperature is nice and warm. When, for example, now here it's 10 degrees Celsius and everybody's inside, of course.
Yeah, and I think here, I mean, there's an interesting thing about public space, because of course the UK has this very sort of traditional culture of pubs, of going to the pubs. And there is something so lovely, like one of my favourite memories is of going to a pub in winter when you've gone for a nice cold walk out in the countryside, and you come in and there's a blazing fire and it smells good and you can have a nice lunch and have a beer. So there's that aspect of it, but it means that, of course, that's associated specifically with food and drink and drinking. Whereas somewhere like this, you go out and there's not, because there's so much public space which is made available for people to play in. You know, you've got kids drawing chalk on the floor, people playing football. It's not necessarily associated with spending money, which means that everyone can come no matter how much money or how little money they make. And B, it's not associated with consumption in the same way that when you go into a pub or a restaurant, you're there specifically to enjoy the food or the drinks. And I think that has a huge part to play, that there are these public spaces that are specifically for gathering. And I think in smaller cities like Barcelona, one thing that I hadn't realised until I came here is that when it's easy to get from one place to another, you know, in London you can take an hour and a half getting from one side to the other, probably more. Here it takes 20 minutes. And so you can literally just pop in on someone on the way home. Or you can say, I'm going to be at this plaza at like, I don't know, 6 o'clock tonight, do you want to join? And people will just show up and you bump into people. And it's such a different experience to what I've previously had of what life can be like. And it really calls to me.
It sounds lovely. I have never been in Barcelona before, so it will be interesting.
Maybe it's time to come visit.
Yes, it is. We've been to Lisbon this summer, and that's also, it is a great city. It's a great city, and I love the hills, hilly kind of city. Lots of walking and then the river banks and everything. I thought it was wonderful.
Did you enjoy the weather? Did you experience yourself differently in that climate?
It's the good thing is that, you know, the weather is. We were there. It was like 25 degrees, so it was not really hot. So it was really comfortable, and So that's always nice, and it gives you a lot of space to go outside and do a lot of stuff. And we had an apartment. We were 6 people together with the whole family, and but most of the time you're just out. You're just outside and out there, and just watching things and going outside and just visiting buildings and all this stuff. So I think it's just great. Let's shift gear a bit, and because. At one point, I sent you an email because I was listening to your podcast, the Hive podcast, and you have all these great conversations with people, also about ecology and about the environment, things that they do, protesting and art. It's a wonderful mixture of a possibility to learn a lot of things together. But in my mind, it was going on and on and on about the situation that we are in with the environment at the moment and the things that we can do or we can't do. And I sent you this long email saying all the things I was working on and thinking about and doing. And for me, it was just a matter of just getting it on paper and forgetting about it again in the meantime. But it lingers in the back, right? So it keeps on coming back, and I keep wondering, what can we do to make this to turn this around? Because you sent me this video from Greta Thunberg about the things that we can do. What was it again? It is protect, restore, and fund. I will put the link to the video in the show notes. And what is it? How do you think that we can participate and make a change?
I think it needs to be on various different levels. I think from my conversations with people who are specialised in particular areas, I have come to realise that if we are to make a big enough impact to mitigate the worst outcomes or the worst scenarios of climate breakdown, it needs to be an intervention which is done at speed and at scale, which means that essentially we're talking about top-down changes. So changes in the ways in which economies are run, changes in the ways in which we fuel our lives. So talking about leaving natural oils and gas in the ground, stopping fracking, investing heavily in renewable solutions, all of these things. But also, when you're looking at that side of things, we need to be able to apply political pressure in order to encourage politicians to make decisions that may not benefit them in their lifetimes from a financial or power perspective. And I think that's the tricky thing that when I dig into this subject, I come up against time and again, which is that the systems that we have in most parts of the world are not designed for rewarding longer term planning and thinking. If you're talking about a 4-year election cycle, for instance, 4 or 5 years, we're going to reward behaviours or we're going to get politicians who are aiming to take short-term decisions, make short-term policy commitments that people will feel immediately, but then will probably have a detrimental long-term impact or effect on our lives and on this earth. And so there's that aspect of the systems change. So I think that's where some interesting approaches, for instance, the non-violent demonstrations that are happening with Extinction Rebellion, that side of things is really important. But from a personal perspective, I also find that for me, small changes that give me a personal sense of immediate impact that enable me to take some of the longer term approaches that I need are also really important, because we know that psychologically speaking, it's very hard for us to take actions that have a long-term reward or outcome. If there's no immediate benefit, it becomes very difficult for us to do it. So this sense of delayed gratification. And so I think it's important, for instance, I've taken steps such as only buying in shops that allow me to bring in little canvas bags that I reuse to buy my grains or to buy my rice, to not buy any kind of vegetables, whatever, they're in plastic. Now, I'm lucky in Barcelona because many of the shops here are small shops, local produce. They don't have plastic anyway. So, and the large ones that do are now starting to realise they should switch from plastic to compostable bags, which is a fairly easy switch to make. So I'm lucky because I'm in a context in which that's really possible. And I think the other side, so I don't really like crowds very much. I did go to a protest recently because I felt it was important to physically bring my body to show up, to take space and to put my body where my mind is. But I think things like this discussion that we're having now, or, you know, the Hive podcast, having conversations where people who may not otherwise access this information can be introduced to things that they could do, ways of thinking they might not have encountered. For me, that's something which I am passionate about and which I feel I have a platform to be able to put to good use. And it's a tricky one because I think on the one hand, the work that I do from day to day on a day-to-day basis is to do with the psychology of online behaviour, but there's so much more that I think about and that I feel about, and that there's so much more to me and there's so much more to everybody else, to you, to everyone listening, than our jobs. And so I think I'm also encouraged by the possibility of maybe bringing more of ourselves into conversation, whether that's at work or in the decisions we make, you know, economically or through the things that we consume or whatever. I think if we can take a more integrated approach where we bring more of ourselves into our daily lives, for me it feels like a bit of a risk, but the alternative is just not worth it. So I don't know if that answers your question. I kind of feel like I'm thinking out loud as opposed to giving a concrete answer.
No, the thing is, this is exactly why I wanted to have this conversation with you, because like you said, you need to talk about it, and your life is not just about work. So, and also you can weave these things into your conversations at work or with the clients or the work that you do for clients. And so this is not a normal episode in my podcast, but I think it therefore fits very well. Can you use your knowledge about psychology and the remote consulting you're doing now to use this thinking with your clients? Is there a way that you could think about how you could use this? This is something I'm struggling with as well. That's what I'm asking.
I don't know. It's tricky because I think when we're doing the kinds of stuff that we're doing, it's associated with the world of work, with technology, with psychology, with behaviour, with marketing. And at first glance, maybe it feels as though there's not an obvious connection. But I think, so for instance, one thing that I've started doing, which feels a bit like a Trojan horse in a way, like an ethical Trojan horse, when I talk about values or homophily, so our love of the same, or ways in which to communicate persuasively. Any of these themes I talk about as, you know, some of the pillars in the work that I do. And I bring in examples of brands who are doing interesting stuff in the environmental and ecological space. So for instance, if I talk about an example for a brand doing great work in creating campaigns that are resonant with its target audience, I'll cite Patagonia. So they're a clothing and outdoors activism brand from the US that is very involved in protecting the natural world. And for instance, recently in the September climate strikes, they actually shut down all of their stores in solidarity with the climate strike protests. And so things like that. So I find that I can weave elements of these things into the talks that I give, but then also from a more practical perspective, I mean, clearly I have to travel a lot for the conferences that I speak at. So one way in which, because, you know, flights are terrible for the environment, and yet you can't yet do hologramming or holographic projections in any sort of robust enough way to completely cut out the travel. So while I'm at school and I still have a limited amount of time that I can use, one thing I'll do, for instance, to try and reduce my flight times is chunk flights together. So if I've got an event that's one day and then a couple of days in between, like I have next week, so I've got something in Berlin and then Paris, I'll stay on in that country and either try and get a train between the two or get one flight as opposed to 2 extra hops coming back and then going again. And from a contractual perspective, I've been thinking about the possibility of introducing a 10% charge which goes directly into carbon offsetting. I already donate, personally to pro-environmental organisations that do different kinds of work. So, for instance, protect Indigenous rights, because Indigenous populations are typically the stewards of some of the most biodiverse areas on Earth. So, Survival International, Amazon Frontlines, and then things like the World Land Trust, trees.org, Greenpeace, whichever ones kind of really speak to you. But maybe bringing that into my contracts and saying, well, look, I want to offset the harm that I'm doing by taking a flight to come and deliver this. Would you be open to doing a 10% fee? And I'm not really sure. I'm kind of, on the one hand, my feeling is that I really should be doing this. I've trialed it once and I'm still waiting to hear back to see what the client says. But it's these sorts of things that I think could at least start to address some of the difficulties that we face. Because if I don't do this work, I'm not going to have the money to pay my mortgage. So there's also that aspect of, I have to be okay with the discomfort of the hypocrisy of saying, yes, I care about the environment, and my livelihood and way of life means that I have to travel, which means I'm harming the environment. And am I strong enough to be someone like Greta Thunberg to say, well, I'm just not going to take flights? The answer for me right now is no. And that's difficult. But that's the truth for this moment in time. How do you work with these competing needs in this way? Like, how do you try and find balance with these competing desires and needs and wanting to affect positive change in your world?
Yeah, I think it's like you said, like you described. It's very difficult. It's a conflicting thing going on in my mind, and I think the same. If you think about marketing, right, and psychology on the web, is that what they want you to do is stay on the website longer, so you look at their advertising more, or they want you to buy more. So there's everything is directed towards more consuming. So we produce stuff that we can buy, so we feel better. That at least the emotion that we feel that we get, because the marketing is pushing that information towards us. If you buy this, then you will be happier, which of course isn't true. But the image that we get is that this is the world that we're going to live in, and it's wonderful, it's beautiful. Right now I'm working with entrepreneurs and trying to help them to make the next level, to the next growth level with their business. For me, it's not. I am struggling with it, but it's not about growth to make more revenue. For me, it's having more impact. How can you impact the life of your clients so that their lives improve? And I think a lot of focus could be on how can you be more profitable or have more impact, instead of how can you get more revenue. Yeah,
I think that's a really good way to look at it, because actually if we're going to look at the research, up to a certain point, I think it was something like 50 grand a year, whether that's in euros or pounds or dollars, I forget now, but up to a certain point, getting more money makes a significant impact on our sense of well-being and abundance and availability of cognitive resources, for instance. Beyond that point, it doesn't have that much of an impact. And it's not to say that one should take a pay cut. I'm not saying that at all, but what I'm saying is that if we know that beyond that particular threshold, the amount of money on top of that we make tends to have less of an impact on our well-being, how might that change our decisions in terms of whether we want to make X amount more money? Maybe we need to, maybe at a certain stage of our lives we don't need to as much. What is it that then becomes more important? Does knowing that fact make make our decision making take a different shape? Like, does it reorient us towards thinking, okay, well, maybe I don't need as much money, maybe I'll consume a bit less, maybe I'll spend more time with my friends? Like, how do we want to live our lives? And I think one of the things that I've been thinking about with the climate stuff, this is going to take quite a dark turn, I'm afraid, but when I look at the worst case scenarios of the research that's coming out, and I think, okay, well, we're not certain about the time frame that we have, but there's going to be huge impact in the global north in the way that there already is in the global south. Makes me confront my mortality and the mortality of this species, and that in itself makes me think, okay, what do I actually care about? Do I care about buying new curtains for my flat? Do I care about buying a new dress? Maybe the answer is yes, maybe it's not. Maybe the answer is, well, maybe I like the idea of that, but I would prefer to spend my time with loved ones or playing music. So I think as humans, we tend to often think about our future lives, what it might look like. Or you mentioned about the marketing of, if you buy this and you'll feel better. Maybe you buy something, you feel better for a short time, and then, you know, that feeling wears off. We hedonically adapt to it. And so, yeah, I think anything that allows us to really feel into the question of, actually, what is it that brings me the greatest sense of fulfillment and aliveness? What needs to be in place for that to be true, for me to wake up and feel like I've got my needs met, but I also feel fulfilled and alive in the way that I'm living? That's going to be helpful.
So with your knowledge about psychology, and I know it's concentrated on the web, but I think you can probably share some thoughts that are more general, is because, of course, it's easy to say, okay, I don't need this dress, or I don't need this thing. I could just also spend the time with a friend. But then we see our neighbor, and he just bought a new car, or she bought a new car, or a new bike, or a new dress, or whatever. And we think, okay, maybe I really do need a new dress because mine is already old, and I need to, I need to stay in a league with the other ones. So, how can we? You are always about, how can you influence people on the web, and how can you use it to your advantage, but not in a mean way, in a good way. But how can you use psychology to help yourself at those moments to not give into this thinking, and just be satisfied with the things you have right now, and just care more about the environment or connections?
That's such a good question. So I'm going to preface this by saying there's nothing wrong with buying a new dress and treating yourself. I'm not talking about being monastic. So, for instance, the things that I get most pleasure from include eating out, so having food. I love food. Having conversations, playing music. Occasionally, I like to buy a new dress or a piece of art. I think it's more about a sense of where that desire is coming from. And I think, of course, we want to feel like we belong. We want that sense of validation from our peers. We want to feel like we are valued participants in the communities in which we live. And I think sometimes one of the shadowy aspects of how we live now in the consumerist societies that we live is that the downside of consumerism is that we feel that unless we buy the new car, unless we buy that new dress, unless we show up with the Rolex or whatever it might be, whatever the item is that signals your value to others, unless we do that, then we're not worthy. I think we know when we have these feelings, really, it's sort of the desire stems from a sense of discomfort as opposed to from a sense of joy. And so I think if we think, I really want to get that because then I'll feel better about myself, and we've all had these feelings, I think, in some way or another, then maybe that's the point at which we give ourselves a moment to not act immediately. So just in the same way that you might batch your emails and say, I'm actually going to delay this action until 11 o'clock or 4 p.m. Maybe we also give ourselves the space and we go, okay, I'm going to treat myself if I want to treat myself, but maybe I delay this action until the next day to see how I feel about it then. Maybe you delay it till the morning, for instance, when we usually have more energy and focus, and our ability to make perhaps wiser decisions is a little bit more nourished. So I think that's one way of doing it. And I think also just, for me, this is not an easy answer to give, but changing the context of your daily life. So if I'm doing lots of reading and listening about the climate's research and the rest of it, I cannot help but be touched by it and be moved by it. And it makes all of the stuff that I might otherwise gravitate towards suddenly feel irrelevant. It's like, well, shit, do I really need a new pair of shoes? No, I don't. I'd rather buy a new plant that's going to help filter my air in my flat. Like things like this, it just frames things differently. So I think also the psychological tool of reframing something based on your values can also be a really powerful way to change how you make your decisions. Yeah.
And I think you can tie it actually back into being in a group that you want to belong to. So right now you are in a group, for example, you're at work or you're an entrepreneur and you are in a group of other entrepreneurs, and all these people talk about growth and about 10x and growing the business and making more products. You could also move to other environments. Like I'm listening to your podcast. I'm listening to Rich Roll, who's vegan, is running. I'm watching a lot of Instagram people who are runners, a marathon or long distance runners, and for me, it helps me to give me some energy and just think, okay, I gotta go and do a run. And if you move this in this direction on an online environment, like listening to podcasts to people promoting this other environment instead of listening to the regular news or watching news on the TV in the evening, it helps me, let's put it that way, it helps me to, like you said, think about, do I need these shoes? No, of course not. I'd rather have a plant. And if you just change the environment, I think you're going in the right direction.
I think your suggestion is brilliant, because this is the thing, we don't have to swap our neighborhoods or make extreme changes to our lifestyle. Even just, for instance, if you're saying about listening to certain podcasts or reading certain material or following specific people, if we know that we have certain values that we would like to live out more in our lives and the choices that we make, then changing our virtual context where we're being exposed to ideas by people whom we look up to, or who we'd like to model some of our actions on or our lifestyles on, then even that will change our context enough to create a different frame of reference, where suddenly we're not just relying on physical circumstance of where we live, the kinds of people that are at work with us. Like, we're also bringing other things into the mix. And of course, I think the other thing is that often people are longing for a deeper sense of being met, of showing up in a different way. And as soon as you start doing this, I was very reluctant initially to have difficult conversations about some of the harder things I'd read in the climate research with friends. And I've found that actually taking the risk with one or two friends suddenly opened up whole kinds of conversations that otherwise they wouldn't have had, things that they'd read that they hadn't dared to share with me, where suddenly the whole conversation changes and the whole context changes all at once, because people suddenly have a sense of being able to contribute in a different way. And I think that also is possible. So when we talk about us changing our own context, of course it's going to change the way in which we relate to other people. And that also gives other people permission to start changing how they might decide to view the world or themselves. And I think that's really powerful.
Yes, I love it. No, I agree. I think, and this is, in the end, it's the same with, like you mentioned before. It is top-down decisions have to be made to make these large changes, to stop reducing fossil fuel, because stopping is impossible at the moment. But reducing fossil fuel and just reducing it in a much higher tempo that we are doing today. And if we want to do that, we cannot just go as a single person to the prime minister or whatever person in the country, because then they will not listen. No, you have to talk to people around you about your thoughts and see if you can, if they have the same feelings at least.
So I think the thing is that we forget, well, some of us forget at some points, is that we're a species, we're social, we've evolved to be together. And not just with one another, but also with all of the other non-human beings that we share this earth with. I mean, we build these cities and we think that we're quite separate, but actually everything is connected. Whether you're talking about, I don't know, through the lens of biodiversity and the food chain, to pollinators and crop cycles, or whatever it is. Like, well, the fundamental is that we're all connected at some very physical, observable level. And the same is true for human systems. And if we can group together and create enough of a vocal demand for our systems to change so that we have more sustainable systems that are conducive to regenerative life for all of nature's systems, then, we're going to be in a much, much better place going forward.
This is... This conversation is so interesting.
Thanks. I feel the same.
I don't know, because I can think about a lot of topics that we could talk about, but I don't want to make it too broad. But so you are now adding more distant consulting work to your business. How do you do this? What are the steps that you're following?
Well, one thing that's quite simple is that typically when I give talks at events, there'll be a couple of people who may be interested in consultancy possibilities, and in recent years, because I've had other priorities and I've been focused on the conference work and also my art, I have turned down new consultancy contracts and offers of collaboration. Now I'm starting to think about the next chapter, and we were talking about projects and stuff, and also about ways in which I can reduce my flights and create a more sustainable business model where I can still help people, but maybe that looks different. And so now I'm much more open to that. So when people come up to me and they inquire, of course, I'm much more likely to say yes. And so that's a big impact. That has a big impact on the possibility of that sort of work coming through. And I think also just telling people about it, saying, look, I'm looking to cut down my flying. I'm still interested in helping companies to use behavioural science principles to connect more meaningfully with their clients. This is another way in which we can work. So we'll see. I mean, it's such early days, and I really do love the conferences. I really enjoy getting up and speaking and hopefully getting people excited about psychology, because it's such an interesting field. So I'm not really sure quite how the future will look, but I think definitely telling people that you're open for that, and then showing up and sharing with people your passion and your skill and your ways of thinking, that's an important way of gathering the potential consultancy clients that you want.
Mm-hmm. I've been watching like companies like Basecamp and Automatic from WordPress, how they are like mostly based offsite, so that all these employees work anywhere in the world, and I find it fascinating how it works, how they get it to work. I've been working since 2006. More and more, I've gotten back into my cocoon in my office in my home, so I could stay with my family and watch my children grow. By that, they are now 20 and 23. So I had a feeling last 1.5 years that for me it was time again to move outside and meet people again and just meet them in person. So I wonder how you will combine this, because I can understand that your love for the conferences is when you meet people, when you can talk to them after your talk, and up front you can meet people that. Oh,
I think I've lost you. Say that again.
Yeah, yes. So I can understand when you're at conferences and when you are meeting people, you talk to them and you have connections, and at the same time you want to try to build remote work, consultancy work, where you don't meet the client, where you just meet them on Skype. For example, all the podcast interviews I've done recently are all in person. So you are one of the few who are on Skype, because there is a different connection when you sit across each other on the at a table and have a conversation than like this. It comes close, but it's not the same.
True.
Now I wonder how you want to bring that same feeling and get the connection with the client on your consultancy work.
Good question. I don't know is the answer.
I'm sorry. I'm just really interested. I don't want to interrogate you. I'm just
no,
really
it's such
interested
a good.
in this.
But I think it's a really important question, and I absolutely agree with you that meeting in person, physically being present with someone, is so much more rich than being on the other side of a screen. It is. So I don't have an answer for that. I think if we know that being physically present with someone else is so much richer than being on the other side of the screen, then of course that's what we're going to want to go for. But I think that the tricky thing is that because we have a current system in which, until recently and still now for the short foreseeable future at least, it's very easy for us to live internationally and to physically show up on someone's doorstep, even if they're, 11 hours flight away in Los Angeles or whatever. Of course, we have a hardwired preference for that, most of us, most of the time. So I don't know. I mean, I think my sense is that the kind of work that I'm doing now is going to shift anyway. I don't know in what direction exactly. I think that some of the stuff that I'm exploring with the arts, with physical connection, with also the music side of things, also the ecological side of things, it's making me yearn for more direct connection with others while at the same time not wanting to fly. And I also think that the challenges that we're seeking to address now in business, which rely on things like behavioural science to encourage us to, optimise things in a certain way so they work better. I think the priorities that we have now are not necessarily going to be the same priorities we'll see in 2, 3, 4, 5 years' time. And so I think I think that the nature of the work that I'm doing is going to change fundamentally. I think the nature of the work that you're doing sounds like already it's changing, that you're taking a much more relational approach. And that, of course, is going to shape what kind of work you end up directing your efforts towards. So it may be that you end up doing much more locally concentrated, networked work where you're working with people closer to you. And wouldn't that be amazing? Yeah. No,
I agree. That's what I'm thinking about this because, there is a trend, of course, that cities becoming larger and people are attracted and moving towards cities. And before we talked about that, you mentioned the number 50,000. What you need, and above that, you will be happy, but not as significant as when you're below that. And if you're in a city, the life is much more expensive.
Yeah.
So, and there's a lot more people around you that you want to kind of compete with, or you are in competition with. Wouldn't the opposite trend be better for the world? That we just live in smaller environments, in smaller towns, villages, and places, and find the work there, and find the clients there, and find the needs there, and grow your own food and all this stuff. It is, I think, that is, like you said, the art is also about the connection with a group of people that you meet when you perform, and that it's usually not a large group, because then you don't have a connection with the crowd.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at there's some really amazing initiatives that have been going for quite some time. If you look at initiatives around transition towns, which has actually started, I think, in the UK, or some of the work that's being done on biomimicry, so using technology to mimic natural systems, and looking at ways in which to use that to create microgrids for instance, electricity, or you look at permaculture models of cultivation where you are seeking to create systems which are regenerative, so food production which is regenerative, which helps restore land while also having multiple other benefits for other systems. So both for humans, for agriculture, for wildlife, etc., etc. So there are lots of initiatives precisely looking at the possibilities for scaling down and creating smaller networked communities, which I think is definitely one option. But then also some of the stuff that I've been reading about, if you look at the potential for greening cities, for the ability to cover, I mean, if you look at places like Singapore, this is already happening in parts of the world, or there's an architectural project in Italy, I think it was in Milan, where they basically created these green skyscrapers where they integrated trees and shrubs and into the building itself, and they were able to attract huge numbers of nesting birds, of bees, of pollinators. So there is a huge potential in the built environment, in cities, for radically transforming how we live, and for creating sort of structures that are much more resilient to climate change. And so there are many different ways of approaching this from what I can tell. And I think we have to be open to what solutions there might be, and then figuring out on a personal level what kind of environment we might most like to be a part of and to contribute towards. And I'm also just conscious, I've got a flight to catch tomorrow, and I'm going to have to leave soon to be able to eat and pack. How are we doing on timing at your end? Are we able to wrap up in the next?
Yes, we are.
5-10 minutes?
We are, because we could talk for a long time. But the next time
it's such a big topic.
Yeah, and the next time when we will talk, we will be sitting across from each other on a table, meeting in person.
Oh, I'd love that.
I have like two questions. So what is, and I borrow these questions from Tim Ferriss, but what is the book that you've been giving away the most lately, or are mostly impacted by?
Oh, can I give you 3?
Yeah, of course. No, it doesn't have to be.
Okay, so there was one that came out fairly recently called How to Change Your Mind, The New Science of Psychedelics, which is by Michael Pollan, which I highly recommend. It's brilliantly written. Another one which personally deeply moved me was a book by the mythologist and psychologist Dr. Sharon Blackie, who I also interviewed for the podcast, and it's called The Enchanted Life. And that one I found absolutely wonderful. And a third book, which has just come out, which I am devouring, is Philip Pullman's new book called The Secret Commonwealth, which is the second in a trilogy that comes after his first trilogy, which he wrote many years ago. So I definitely recommend those 3 books. Yeah.
Wow. That's good. That's interesting. Okay. What is the podcast that you listen to the most, that you don't miss an episode of?
On Being by Krista Tippett.
On Being. Okay. Interesting. Never heard of it. So this is all great, because I haven't heard these titles before. I haven't listened to this. So new things on my list. That's just great. Before we go, what is it where people can reach you, can find you, can learn more about you?
So you can go to nathalienahai.com. I have literally just updated my website. It went live yesterday, so you can check that out. You can find the Hive podcast. If you search the Hive podcast and my name, it will come up on Spotify and iTunes and SoundCloud. And then I'm somewhat active on Twitter. I've taken slightly a step back from social platforms so I can focus on other things. But yeah, so I'm on Twitter, and for my art and poetry type side of stuff, I use Instagram for that. So yes. I I think that's it, yeah.
Yes, if you're interested in art, just really, really follow her Instagram. That's really lovely to see her drawings and paintings. Nathalie, thank you very much for this broad discussion that we had, because this was something I needed at this point, and hopefully when you're listening today, this is something that you need or are willing to talk to about other people, because that's what we just talked about. I think it is important that we talk about these issues and share the ideas with the other. Like Nathalie said before, when I talked about this with my friends, I learned about how they thought, and we came closer than we expected. Thank you, Nathalie, and talk to you next time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Dat was het bijzondere gesprek met Nathalie. Ik hoop dat je het net zo waardevol als ik vond om samen na te denken over hoe beïnvloedt nou eigenlijk ons doen en laten en ons bedrijf en ons ondernemerschap, de ecologie, het milieu en wat kunnen we daaraan doen. Je vindt de namen en links die we noemen in het artikel dat bij deze uitzending hoort. Ook bijvoorbeeld de links die ze geeft naar de organisaties die zij ondersteunt. Ga daarvoor naar ernohanning.nl/show222. Wil je vanzelf automatisch de volgende aflevering van deze podcast op jouw telefoon krijgen? Dat kan, en als je een iPhone hebt is het heel simpel. En dat is namelijk standaard de Apple Podcast app op je telefoon. Open deze app. Zoek op de Erno Show en je vindt hem. Klik wat plusje. Vanaf dat moment krijg je vanzelf de volgende afleveringen. Heb je nu een Android-telefoon? Ook simpel. Installeer een podcast-app zoals die van Player FM. Zoek de Erno Show op. Klik op plusje, abonneer en vanzelf krijg je de volgende afleveringen. Dankjewel alvast. Het is super fijn dat je dat doet. Heb je vragen, opmerkingen, reacties over deze aflevering met Nathalie of over de podcast in het algemeen? Stuur dan een e-mail naar podcast@ernohanning.nl. Ik hoor super graag van jou. Wil jij weten hoe je meer rust krijgt terwijl je er eigenlijk helemaal geen tijd voor hebt? Hoe je ruimte vrijmaakt om meer te werken aan je bedrijf in plaats van in je bedrijf? Hoe je het netto resultaat van je bedrijf verhoogt zonder harder te werken? Vraag dan het gratis boek Betere Beslissingen, Beter Bedrijf aan op ernohanning.nl. Dit is mijn nieuwste boek. Je krijgt het helemaal gratis. Zeker als je de digitale versie downloadt. Wil je het fysieke boek, dan krijg je het boekje nog steeds gratis, maar betaal je alleen de verzendkosten. Vraag jouw boek nu aan op ernohanning.nl. En je leest het in 1 avond uit. Zo'n dun boekje is het. Dankjewel en graag tot de volgende.
Dankjewel voor het luisteren naar de Erno Hanning Show op ernohanning.nl.